Okay. Eugene Finerman. Today is Sunday, November 3rd. Hanukkah, and then what happened is our topic. But for those at Macomb, we know that Eugene has been a stalwart of our choir and has lately had some COVID throat problems, hopefully, but you'll be able to hear him today. And was also famously, or maybe infamously, on Jeopardy in 1987. Please hold your Jeopardy questions until the end. He is going to he will talk to us, and we can take questions at the end. And now I'm going to help him share his screen. Yeah. And then it'll be over there. Look at that from the beginning. There we go. Yeah, you should sit somewhere where you can see the screen.
Yes, please. Because, I want to offer you an alternative to staring at me. As attractive as I am by Jeopardy standards. Yeah, but anyway, how do you do? I'm, as she said correctly, Eugene Finerman. Whether through an abundance of talent or immature ambivalence, I'm both a writer, a historian, I'm a writer, historian, and satirist. And you may see elements of both in today's lecture. Now, first, the story of Hanukkah and after. How do you like the fact that a menorah suddenly looks like a Greek temple inverted? Well, I have a talented friend named Nadine Eastwood, who is able to take my quirks and turn it into clever, incisive art. And in a way, it's also appropriate to our theme, because once the Jews were free of the Greeks, they were eager to Hellenize after the fact. Anyway, yes?
Oh. I'm just adjusting your...
Oh, I'm sorry. Have I been decapitated?
No. Yes, you were decapitated.
Well, I happen to be a fan of the French Revolution too, but that's another lecture. It was good for the Jews. In any case, Hanukkah is regarded as a psychological crutch, the solace and compensation of not having Christmas. 2,000 years ago, our ancestors saw Jesus Christ Superstar with the original cast, and we were not impressed. Fish and loaves without cream cheese. If you're going to perform a miracle, do it right. Now, as it turned out, the touring company of Jesus Christ Superstar was very successful. The world was ready for monotheism, but without all our dietary laws. So, we had better salami and the consolation prize of Hanukkah. But Hanukkah was always meant to be a celebration of being a minority. We defied the tyranny of Greek culture. Take a look at the map of the classical world. Greek here, Greek there, Greek to the south, Egypt, Alexandria. But look, there's a little menorah sort of sandwiched in, almost besieged, but withstanding it. Now, how did the world become Greek? Sometimes megalomania is justified. Alexander the Great made Julius Caesar and Napoleon feel inferior. Genghis Khan might have been his military equal, but never achieved the high fashion glory of Alexander. The world conqueror was regarded as a god in his lifetime, and the passing of time and several ridiculous movies have yet to diminish the glory. You can't say that Alexander was a self-made man. He was the king of Macedonia and had the best army in Greece. But those were the gifts of his father, Philip. The idea of conquering Persia was a cherished fantasy among the Greeks, but a student of Aristotle should have been more logical. However, Alexander quite logically considered that he would either be a glorious success or a glorious failure. And a glorious failure probably would not have to live with the embarrassment. Let's see, what does it take to conquer Persia? Well, just 30,000 men and me. In 334 BC, or before BCJ, before cousin Jesus, the 22-year-old Macedonian invaded the Persian Empire. Of course, Persia dismissed the reckless boy. The provincial governors first tried to stop Alexander with the equivalent of the Asia Minor National Guard. And that is how Persia lost Asia Minor. The following year, the Persians mustered an army twice the size of Alexander's. And that is how they lost Syria, Judea, and Egypt. It turns out that mere numbers were no strategy against Alexander. The Persian army was little more than a badly equipped mob. Facing the better armed and brilliantly led Greeks, the Persians had one of two choices: to patiently wait to be impaled by the Macedonian phalanx, or run, hoping that the Greek cavalry would tire of slaughtering them. That was the one advantage of Persian numbers. Shah Darius, and yes, they did use the word Shah Darius himself had proved an embarrassment. He led the army into battle, but was foremost in the retreat, even abandoning his family to the Greeks. By the way, this is from Pompeii, or it's now in the Museum of Naples, but it was a fresco, and it was said to be a copy of some Greek original that's now long lost. But this is a statue of Alexander facing Darius in battle. As I said, sometimes megalomania is justified. Let's recite some of Alexander, and this is his world, his empire. Let's recite some of his titles. He started off as the king of Macedonia and the hegemon of that is to say, leader of the Hellenic League, Greece. He would become pharaoh of Egypt, shah of Persia, and lord of Asia. I mean, just look, from Egypt into India. His glory was immortal, but his liver was not. He certainly had reason to celebrate, and with the same manic energy, he drank himself to death in 323 BCE at the age of 32. He had a lot of living to do. Before COVID, that would have sounded better. But he left a Hellenized world. Taking notes, Sarah? He left a Hellenized world. Because she asked. Anyway, his empire was divided among his generals. Seleucus grabbed Syria, and his ancestors would continue to rule it for 2 centuries. Seleucus, and the Greeks tend to pronounce every syllable. Seleucus. Okay, just to give you an example of how lyrical their language is, you would say that the belligerent prima donna of the Iliad is Achilles. The Greeks would say Achilles. It really is lyrical, Achilles. The Germans are the same way about pronouncing every vowel and syllable, except their language is gargled rather than spoken, so it's not quite as melodious. Anyway, now, Seleucus was Greek, as was the ruling caste. And those Hellenes, Hellene, by the way, is what the Greeks actually call themselves. Hellenes, or Hellenes, made themselves comfortable by recreating the Greek culture in their kingdom. The same was true of the other grasping Greek and Macedonian generals. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, was Hellenized. What was their capital? Alexandria, city they built. There were Hellenized satraps governors in Afghanistan and India. Even Buddha now looked Greek. Yes, yeah, it looks remarkably like a statue of Apollo, but that's actually Buddha. Who could resist all the enticements of Western civilization? Art, theater, medicine, bathing. However, one idiosyncratic province within Syria's realm seemed to prefer its 100 dietary laws, so it rose in rebellion. Now, between us, the theater was great, but new gymnasiums, were a bit much. Nonetheless, had we been a little more receptive to assimilation, Pygmalion might have been a musical 2,000 years sooner. Oops, sorry. Now, Rhapsody in Jew. Over 8 nights of Hanukkah, we light an increasing number of candles, probably trying to find a decent song for the holiday. Jews obviously can write music. Let's count the Gentiles of Tin Pan Alley. Cole Porter, Meredith Willson, Andrew Lloyd Webber. That didn't take long. The Gentiles of Israel Ballin, I think, if we're checking for foreskins, we wouldn't find one. Even Jerome Kern was actually Jewish. I mean, the name sounds Irish, but back in Hungary, I'm sure it was somewhat a few syllables longer. Oh, and Richard Rogers, too. I mean, yes, he could have passed for Presbyterian, but yeah. Anyway. Now, what can explain our inability to write Rhapsody in Jew for Hanukkah? I wonder if it can be attributed to our other great creation, guilt. Perhaps we have a belated regret that we did not slightly assimilate sooner. Or as I would say, Parthenon Plust. I like puns. If only we could go back in time. Imagine me on the steps of the temple. Here's what Hellas has to tell us. I'm going to say it the English way. Achilles, Socrates, Sophocles. Can William Crystal compare to these? All we are saying is give Greece a chance. Do you want to join me? All we are saying is give Greece a chance. Why be bereft of these gifts? Philosophy, comedy, and best of all, democracy. Let's not dwell on sodomy. All we are saying is give Greece a chance. All we are saying is give Greece a chance. In fact, Jews could be quite susceptible to Hellenism when it was applied with charm rather than coercion. The Jews living under the Ptolemies enjoyed the Greek culture. The Jewish population of Alexandria was twice that of Jerusalem. They had an autonomous civil organization, their community administered by their own council of elders. Their religious services were in Greek. For half a century, Judea was under the Ptolemies, and the same benevolent rule was applied there. The Jewish province of Judea was administered by a council of elders in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, Judea found herself the frontier between Egypt and Syria was aggressive. Those two The two kingdoms fought 5 wars between 275 and 200 BCE, with Syria eventually winning. The Judeans would miss the Egyptians. Oops, sorry. A descendant of Seleucus, Antiochus III planned to expand his empire into Greece. His new Judean subjects found themselves subsidizing his ambitions with higher taxes. 1/3 of their crops were donated to the Syrian coffers. There was a slight obstacle. If Antiochus wanted to conquer Greece, Rome had the same idea at the same time. Guess who won? And the Romans had half the size of the army, but they still won decisively against the Greeks, the Syrian Greeks. The Romans pushed Antiochus out of Greece and then defeated him in Asia Minor in 190 BCE. His son, Antiochus IV, inherited a smaller empire and the added burden of paying tribute to Rome. He took out his frustration on Judea, attempting to eliminate Judaism itself and enforcing Hellenism in its place. The temple's treasury was seized, the observance of the Sabbath and circumcision were banned, and a statue of Zeus was set up in the temple. The glories and gifts of Greek civilization were not presented in the most persuasive manner. Good-looking fellow, though. The glory that was Greece. Under the supervision of Syrian officials, Jews were obliged to sacrifice to the Greek gods. In the town of Modi'in, a Jewish priest named Mattathias chose to sacrifice the Syrian official himself, as well as a Hellenized Jew. That is how the rebellion began. Mattathias had 5 sons who are remembered as the Maccabees. The word means hammer. The family name actually was Hasmon. The rebellion began in roughly the period between 168 and 167 of BCE. The HBO series. Now, Mattathias was succeeded by his son Judah, who regained Jerusalem in the period between 165 and 164 BCE. That is the occasion celebrated in Hanukkah, Feast of the Dedication. Antiochus died in 164. Jewish sages like to say it was the shock of losing Jerusalem. However, the war continued. Judah died in battle in 160 BCE, and his brother Jonathan assumed the leadership. The Syrians provided inadvertent assistance by diverting themselves with palace coups. Antiochus' son was murdered by his cousin, who then was engaged in a civil war with another claimant to the throne. Under the circumstances of the civil war among the Greek Syrians, the Syrians offered a truce in 153 BCE. Jonathan tried picking sides in the Syrian civil war and got himself captured and killed in 143 BCE. But his murder was an act of spite rather than a strategic achievement. Syria was too exhausted to pursue the war, and it conceded Judean independence in 142 BCE. A Jewish victory. This was at a time when the Jews hardly ever won, obviously long before there were Nobel Prizes in economics or Emmy Awards for comedy writers. Then what? The subsequent history of the Maccabees. Notice there are no Gentiles depicted here. No Gentiles were harmed in this lecture, or slandered anyway. For the first time in 4 centuries, there was an independent Jewish state. Of course, independence is a relative term because the Maccabees insisted on being the royal family. True, if anyone deserved it, but they turn out to be much better soldiers than rulers. I mean, take a look, the world at the time. You can see, Egypt, the various Greek states. And you see actually to the east of Syria, the Persians have reemerged as a kingdom called Parthia. Jewish art before Chagall. Our coins versus theirs. You know the prohibition on graven images. Of course, it saved the Jewish taxpayer a fortune in marble. However, we now have no idea how any of the Maccabees looked. Compare the coins of Judea and Syria. We depict inanimate objects, and the Greeks have, good-looking rulers, Okay, Simon the Wise, as I say, it's a guess, but at least Kirk Douglas was Jewish. The last survivor of the Maccabee brothers, Simon was the prince and high priest. He did not presume to call himself king, the formal title of king. That title was thought to be only for those of the house of David. In 142 BCE, Syria formally conceded the independence of the Jewish enclave. Simon's assassination 7 years later was not exactly a breach of the treaty, but certainly bad sportsmanship. The last surviving son of Simon, who may or may not have looked like Cornel Weiss, really. As I say, no Gentiles are being depicted in this. Now, John, his son, Yohanan, really, ruled as prince and high priest from 134 to 104 BCE, so 30 years. Syria was declining in power and could not protect Samaria. John also conquered the Arab kingdom of Idumea, coercing its people to convert to becoming Jewish. That would bring Herod the Great into the congregation. He was Semitic, but he wasn't a Jewish, his ancestors weren't Jewish. John tripled the size of the Jewish state by conquering, as you see the areas in purple, Samaria and Idumea. Emmanuel Goldenberg. The first to call himself king, Alexander Jannaeus, calling himself Alexander, which isn't exactly a Jewish name, but he took the name Alexander quite literally, conquering all of Galilee, the Mediterranean coast from Gaza to Syria, and pushing across the eastern Jordan. With Gaza in his control, he now got his cut of the trade with India. Now, the population of Galilee was forced to become Jewish. So anti-Semites have claimed that Jesus was not really Jewish, even if he thought so. In any case, they still can't claim he was Aryan blonde. The original Galileans, I don't think so, or Jeffrey Hunter. In that part of the world, an Aryan blonde would have been a greater miracle than a virgin birth. Actually, I like the film King of Kings, but, despite Jeffrey Hunter, as Jesus, you can see him trying to surf on the Sea of Galilee. I mean, all American boys were rather rare at the time in Judea. All right. As Exodus recounts, Moses had political opposition within the Israelite camp. Yes, some of the ex-slaves were nostalgic for Egypt. 40 years in the desert usually loses its charm after the first week or so. So you can imagine Alexander Jannaeus would stimulate some political discussion. Josephus tells us that there were three main parties in Judea. The king was popular among a faction called the Sadducees, wealthy landowners who controlled the temple's council of elders. They were quite conservative in their worship. Do you dislike the king? For those who disliked the king and the temple's monopoly on Judaism, or just enjoyed arguing over the Torah. Their political party was the Pharisees. The word Pharisee is from the Hebrew word for separate, referring to their division from the Sadducees. As an alternative to the Jerusalem monopoly, the Pharisees believed that Jewish worship could be sustained within the community, led by a teacher. The Jewish word for teacher is rabbi. Between us, the idea would catch on. And do you dislike the world? But a Messiah would be nice. The Essene, the holy, the pious. Ironically, the word is Greek. They possibly refer to themselves as Hasidim. They were ascetic and lived among themselves. Our knowledge of them is derived from their legacy, the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of those scrolls describes the ultimate battle between good and evil. So scholars do consider the scrolls a possible link between the Essenes and early Christianity, as well as Marvel Comics. Here, I'm giving you a choice of stereotypes. When Alexander Jannaeus died of surprisingly natural causes, his widow, Salome Alexandra, served as the regent for the two princes. She proved a capable politician. The Pharisees liked her, but she could not serve as high priest. One of her sons would. Should we cast a vote? Who would you like to be the cast in the role? Assuming the high priest required no ability, her oldest son, Hyrcanus II, was dull, weak, but with the right glands. But the boys were not good at sharing. When mom died in the year 67, baby brother Aristobulus, you notice the names are not exactly Jewish anymore, Aristobulus seized the throne. Hyrcanus might have settled for an allowance. However, the incompetent prince did have one advantage: the brilliant, ruthless advisor named Antipater from Idumea. Evil genius for hire, Laszlo Lowenstein to his mother, and the Third Reich. Antipater preferred a civil war to surrender. Calling upon an Arab army to assist him in Hyrcanus, victory seemed likely. But then Aristobulus thought he had a brilliant idea. He would ask the Romans for help. They had just completed their conquest of Syria, and no doubt were feeling, in a magnanimous mood, happy to help some squabbling princes in a neighboring country. Meeting the two princes, the Roman commander, Pompey, could see that Hyrcanus was weak and incompetent, and that was exactly what Rome wanted in a neighbor. So Hyrcanus was reinstalled on the throne as ruler and high priest. Pompey knew that if any competence was required, Antipater was a willing collaborator. Aristobulus was offered house arrest in a pleasant Italian villa. He would eventually be poisoned. For his administrative fee, Pompey sacked the treasury of the temple. But who would rule Rome? Pompey versus Caesar. A civil war that lasted 4 years. Since Pompey had sacked the Temple of Jerusalem, Julius Caesar found himself very popular among the Jews. When he took Alexandria, 1/3 of the city was Jewish and supported Julius Caesar. In return, after he had won the wars, he was the patron for the first synagogue in Rome. Julius Caesar was considered a friend of the Jewish people, our first sponsor of the synagogue in Rome. And when he died, Roman historians note that the Jews were foremost among his mourners. Now, let's see, what had been Pompey's man in Jerusalem now was Caesar's man in Jerusalem, Antipater. You know, flexible. But, you know, Caesar had made himself dictator for life, but apparently life is a relative term. Let's see, Caesar's man in Jerusalem now was Cassius's man in Jerusalem. In the aftermath of Caesar's murder, Cassius became governor of Syria and Jerusalem. In preparing for the war with Antony and Octavian, Cassius extorted men and money from his provinces. Meeting Cassius's demands, Antipater put his sons to work. Their names were Faisal and Herod. Around this time, Antipater died, poisoned. Someone didn't appreciate him. Cassius's new man in Jerusalem. Actually, he called himself Erich von Stroheim. He was no von, and it was really Harry Stroheim. He tried passing himself off as an aristocrat, but Billy Wilder, who knew what aristocrats sounded like, though not in his own genealogy, and he knew that von Stroheim was a fraud. Anyway, here's my imagining of the young Herod. There are no images of him. Despite being a thorough SOB, he did adhere to Jewish prohibition against, graven images. So we don't know what Herod actually looked like. Cecil B. DeMille thought that he would, of course, look Jewish, and so cast Joseph Schildkraut in a film, although the Yiddish accent was probably an anachronism. Anyway, young Herod. He proved a very capable monster. Rome found him appalling but indispensable. Hearing that Herod had executed 2 of his sons, Augustus quipped that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. And Herod did have 5 more sons, so don't worry about, one of the benefits of having 9 wives. Whatever Herod's parental failings, Rome could depend on him. Herod controlled his subjects, offering munificent buildings and ruthless terror. As I said, we actually have no idea how he looked because that nasty Jewish boy did defer to the law against graven images. Now, while Rome was preoccupied with the civil war between Cassius and Brutus on one side and Mark Antony and Octavian on the other, the Parthians invaded. They rampaged through Syria, invaded Judea, captured the high priest Hyrcanus, replacing him with his nephew Antigonus. Yeah, those Jewish names are very impressive. Antigonus. Herod escaped. His brother was killed. The Jews would regard this as a liberation from Rome and, while short-lived, hoped that the Parthians would return. In the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Revelation, this invasion would be the basis of the battle between good and evil. But in the Jewish mind, the evil were the Romans, and the good were the Parthians and Persians. Yeah, depiction. The Parthian Persian cavalry, and the Parthian. You can see a picture of the Parthian Empire. It's large, though not as large as the Roman Empire. The refugee Herod ingratiated himself with Antony, who became his sponsor to the Roman Senate. The Senate recognized him as king of Judea. Now, with Roman support, he had to reconquer his kingdom. Within a 3-year campaign, he did. The Parthians, who had appointed a king and high priest, had left. Their candidate was executed. Now, Herod did not presume to be high priest, but he did begin appointing and replacing the occupants of the position. Well, of course, Mark Antony and Octavian were victorious, so within a few years they had turned on each other. Rome had another civil war. In 31 BCE, two fleets converged upon Actium in western Greece. The ships seemed to personify their leaders. Antony's galleys were grand, powerful, but lumbering. Their oarsmen could barely move them. Octavian's galleys were small, quick, and decisive. They kept moving, shooting, and ramming Antony's paralyzed behemoths until they literally were dead in the water. Realizing defeat, Cleopatra fled the battle and sailed home to Egypt. Antony followed her, abandoning the remnants of his fleet as well as his army. Without their commander, those 19 legions surrendered to Octavian. Now theoretically, there would have been Jewish contingents with Mark Antony's fleet. But knowing how clever Herod was, he probably sent, Octavian a lovely deli platter. The following year, Octavius occupied a defenseless Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra killed themselves. If Antony lost, so presumably did his ally Herod. Yet, guess who's Octavian's man in Jerusalem? As always, Herod emerged victorious. He would rule until his death in 4 BCE. Since the Gospels state that Jesus was born in Herod's reign, then the AD chronology is off by at least 4 years. And the church admits it. It's a matter of bookkeeping, not theology. So the church admits, yeah, it's not really 4. It's, he wasn't really born in 1 AD. He was born like 4 or 6 BCE. Anyway, so Herod, shall we say, his patrons varied, but it was always Jerusalem. That was the one constant. Herod rebuilt Jerusalem. I mean, you'll see the remnants of his monuments all around the city, including the Wailing Wall, which was a retaining wall for the temple that he rebuilt. He had learned that it was too easy, that Jerusalem was too easy to capture, and he wanted his capital to be both his monument and his protection. Even the temple was redesigned to serve as a fortress. There you see the temple on the right, as well as what is it seems to be an intelligent replica of what ancient Jerusalem looked like. Anyway, so with the temple as Herod's fortress, God had to share his sanctuary with the leader. It should be noted that one can never have too many fortresses. In Herod's case, paranoia was a sensible attitude. Yes, Mark Antony liked him, but Cleopatra never did. Masada was just a precaution, but there was no reason that a last refuge fortress shouldn't have a few luxuries, so you'll find Roman baths in Masada too. Now, Herod's precautions were far-sighted. He just didn't guess who would be using them. 70 years after his death, Jewish rebels would seize Jerusalem and revolt against Rome, precisely what Herod had sought to avoid. He did speak Greek, so he would have recognized the word irony. You see, I should note that the siege lasted 139 days. It should be noted when Rome was besieged by the Visigoths, some 350 years later, the city fell in 3 days. Mighty Rome didn't have the resilience, while the Jews held out for, 140 days. Now, of course, Jerusalem was destroyed, as was the temple. The consequences of the rebellion, well, according to Josephus, there were 1 million dead and 100,000 slaves, 10,000 of whom were assigned to build an amphitheater in Rome, the Colosseum. So if you've been watching PBS in the year 70 to 80, you would have seen this new Colosseum with a surprisingly Jewish cast. Now, the Arch of Titus celebrates Rome's triumph. How many of you have seen the Arch of Titus? It's, on the frieze, you can see the Romans carrying away the temple's menorah. It was in Rome, and it continued to exist for another 4 centuries. It was eventually signed over to the church when their triumph over Judaism. When the Visigoths sacked Rome, they did respect churches, and so it stayed in Rome. They may have slaughtered, they may have raped and robbed, but they respected churches. So, ironically, 40 years later, the Vandals, when they took Rome, didn't engage in massive, slaughter. They just were thorough thieves. And they did rob the churches, taking the menorah with them. And it was in Carthage. The last reported sighting of it was in the year 534, when the Byzantines had captured the Vandal capital in North Africa of Carthage. And from there, it disappeared. I mean, apparently it was melted down to build Hagia Sophia, I'm guessing. The gold would have been stripped away, the brass would have been used for, seams, but we know that it was in existence in 534, in the year 534, and then it disappears. Anyway, but you see the Romans carrying away the menorah. But so did we. In those 2,000 years, Rome fell, new nations have risen, Saturnalia became Christmas, yet the people of the Maccabees remain, dispersed around the world, but still withstanding the prevailing culture, still defying time and tyranny. Hanukkah is a continuing story. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Just gonna,
Oh,
yeah, my magic here. Stop
oh,
sharing.
did I think I forgot to hit share? Did you? Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So we're going to take questions. A couple of things. Who knew that Essenes, Pharisees, and Sadducees would be, so linked with our current culture and those different film stars? I did not know Herod had a brother, and I never thought about why we don't have a picture of Herod. So we always learn. If you have a question, just raise your hand. You have to be really loud so that the people can hear, just like me. Questions? Marilyn.
Today we celebrate as Jews, not the military part of it, but the spiritual part. That the light is still shed within Nora and within us. We don't really think about the military situation as much as the cultural.
I'm sure it was the real legacy, our lasting legacy, whereas the military victory, was transient because within a few years we'd be under Rome's heel. Our military victories, were ephemeral, but our lasting legacy, our heritage, our pride is in the culture itself, the identity.
Just great Jewish people, heritage, we teach our children, and the legacy that lives on, the life within it.
Exactly. Yes.
It's a beautiful holiday, but it's also part of the Torah. I think that's important.
Because who wrote that history? A rabbi, you could disagree with me, but the rabbis did. They didn't want us, celebrating the victory and You know, this is a much more,
It's also it's long after.
yes, yes.
Sort of long done, but it's not in the Bible. It's not.
It's so interesting.
It is in the New Testament. Right?
Yes,
The story of Hanukkah.
yes.
Sarah and then Jeff.
So Hanukkah predates Christmas by a long hundreds of years.
Well, 160 years, yes.
Your comment.
And miracles of light, that was ever been in Midrash Ephraim.
And you find that in the Talmud. You know, right? So the story of the diminishing oil, right, doesn't appear in the books of the Maccabees either. So
When did Hanukkah start being celebrated?
In our, you know, its commercial importance was within, you know, the last century. Oh,
the Israeli Sukkot, right? You know, when
They were fighting during actual Sukkot and then.
that's right. So when the Maccabees actually restored the temple, the first thing they do is bring sacrifice to the temple for Sukkot, which they missed, which is an 8-day holiday. Right? We just went through it for 8 days. So that's why Hanukkah. Right. But this is you take the questions.
well, I defer to the theology. To you, sir.
Dr. Privilege, who are the two actors representing the two human princes?
You're showing your age. Seth Rogen and James Franco, who was raised, you know, Jewish mama, determined he brought him, you know, he had definitely has a strong Jewish identity. And yes, Peter Lorre, Laszlo Lowenstein, and Eric von Stroheim, well, you know, Harry Stroheim to his parents, was Herod. And of course, and Cornell Wilde, who was a matinee idol in the 40s and 50s, but and was a champion fencer. You know, so
You could find a place for John Garfield.
you know, if I had done, I had actually thought of doing a chart of Herod's sons. I would have actually had Stephen Miller as one absolutely appalling son who Herod killed. And then I would have had two sons who would have been kind of overbearing, really didn't deserve to be killed, but were obnoxious. And I definitely thought William Shatner would have been one. And then for the last few sons, I would have had the four Stooges, you know, Feinberg and Horowitz, as in Howard, you know, Howard family. No, John Garfield, Jules Garfinkel, certainly was the first truly Jewish matinee idol. Let's talk about, I'm going off on a tangent. There were other Jewish actors, but, you know, often, they didn't, and Edward G. Robinson never denied being Emanuel Goldenberg, you know, was quite proud of it. Once when he, at, you know, the studio, the ambassador from Romania, you know, which had a vehemently anti-Semitic government, said, "Oh, I understand." You know, was visiting, and he, you know, came up to Edward G. Robinson, and he said, "I understand you're a subject, you know, former citizen of Romania. The king would be thrilled if you signed his autograph. If you signed your autograph." And so Edward G. Robinson did, in Yiddish. Best regards, Emanuel Goldenberg. Yeah, but yes, yes, sir, doctor.
The person, Josephus,
Yes.
you know, part of our history we know from his chronicles. But what's your thought about Josephus? He's kind of a controversial character because he kind of went over to the Romans.
Oh, he definitely went over to the Romans. He is, if you ignore all the credit he gives himself, they should have only listened to me. I knew it, you know, I was right, they were all wrong. You know, you could easily have seen him recommending an invasion of Iraq in 2003. You know, the William Crystal of his day. But in much of his work, he is accurate. his numbers, whether there were, you know, 1 million dead in Jerusalem, or during the war, maybe an exaggeration, but they weren't very precise with numbers in those days. But, you know, in most cases, and his description, and when he doesn't have any vested self-aggrandizement, like when describing the various Jewish denominations or political parties, he can be relied upon. He's pretty accurate. As I said, he will self-aggrandize himself, but otherwise he's pretty accurate, I think. And believe me, we're grateful to have him, because there's no one like equivalent during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. No one like that at all. So we really don't know why there was a rebellion, especially because the Roman emperor at that time was a very excellent ruler, Hadrian. You could see why people would rebel during the reign of Nero, but Hadrian? I mean, no. And so why that particular case, we don't know. Yeah. Ironically, it's through some of the rival monotheistic group that we know that Bar Kokhba was a tyrant, because he persecuted Christians. So, you know, it's from other sources. And we know that from the Roman sources, it was a hard battle. Hadrian himself had to go to Judea to campaign. And he was so infuriated with the Jews that he renamed the state for the Philistines. The area, you know, Palestine comes from there, from them, from Hadrian's temper tantrum, naming it for a not long extinct people, the Philistines, Palestine. Any other questions? Anyone here? I have no idea. Oh, I say.
Real loud. Go ahead if you have people online.
I don't know. Are there people online?
No.
Oh.
You're good.
Oh.
Real loud.
Okay.
Well, it's not a question, it's a thought. As a child, I can remember learning that talking so much about the oil that was found in the synagogue, the story that in the myth that lasted for 8 days, and each night that we light the candle, it's a mitzvah to light a candle. Each night we perform a mitzvah. But the interesting fact that I learned that if you had one candle and Hanukkah fell on Shabbat, you don't light, and you say, well, Shabbat comes every weekend, but we always light Shabbat. But if it falls on Hanukkah, you have only one candle, you light Shabbat.
Yes.
Because that's holy and that's peace. And I thought that was a beautiful lesson to share.
So the next lecture will be in 8 days. I'll discuss Byzantine history. That should summarize.
Yeah, and I only if you, you know, have it with different, movie characters. So, a couple announcements again. Next week, we do not have anything at 10 o'clock. At 12:30, we have Living and Giving. Please come. Free lunch. You have to sign up for that. I can show you where to do that. And in 2 weeks, we have Adam Nimoy, Leonard Nimoy's son, who's coming to talk about his book, The Most Human. Again, light lunch. Please come. That'll start at 12:30. And the rest of our calendar will get out to you. And if you have any questions, come see me. I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Okay.
Let's see what somebody said. Oh, that was
Thank you so much.
okay.
Thank you. Yes, Vanessa.
My pleasure.
Yes. Thank you.
Thinking that Alexander was a Jewish name.
Oh, no.
Alexander is kind of revered